Hi, class. Welcome to week 9 of your hospitality facilities management class. This is our last week before spring break. So, our last assignment, and then you'll have a week off. And I hope that you all enjoy your spring break. This week, we're talking about productivity standards, benchmarking, and staff scheduling. Our objectives this week are to understand what a productivity standard is and how it's used, to understand what a benchmark is and how it's developed and why we use them, to learn how to create a staffing guide based on hotel occupancy for a housekeeper position, to understand the calculations and figures used in a staffing guide. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to calculate a hotel's occupancy, calculate total labor hours needed, determine the number of employees that should be scheduled based on hotel occupancy, and calculate the estimated labor based on the hotel occupancy. And at the end of the lesson, you will know how to create a staffing guide and a staff schedule. When we talk about productivity, we're referring to the ratio between input and output at a specific quality level. We use this as a form of measurement to determine performance standards. For the purposes of the housekeeping department, the input is the number of hours worked in a day, a week, or a month, and how many rooms a housekeeper can clean per hour. We need to make sure that they're meeting the set productivity standard for how many rooms they should clean in 1 hour. We can also look at payroll costs and expenses when we analyze our number of hours worked. Did the number of hours worked in the department meet the scheduled number of labor hours we set based on the hotel's occupancy? If yes, then great. If no, then as a manager, we need to determine why we overspent on hours. There could be a lot of reasons why we overspent. It could be because the housekeeping manager did not schedule appropriately. Perhaps there were too many call-offs and overtime had to be worked. Occupancy could have dropped, causing too many people to be staffed because the housekeeping manager didn't review the occupancy the day before and make changes to the schedule. Occupancy could have increased, and there weren't enough housekeepers scheduled to clean a number of rooms needed. There are a lot of reasons why the budget may have been exceeded or not met at all. The output is a number of rooms cleaned and is based on using the resources that we have access to. It's important that the housekeeping manager is using the resources that they have to meet productivity levels. Remember, the housekeeping department could be working with limited resources. Even so, the housekeeping manager needs to use them wisely and still meet the productivity standards. Productivity standards must be determined and set in order to appropriately staff the department within the limitations of the department's operating budget. Productivity standards will vary from housekeeping department to housekeeping department and will be dependent on the duties of the housekeeping attendant and the skill level of the hotel. An economy hotel will have a different productivity standard than a luxury hotel. An essential part of the housekeeping manager's role is to know how long it should take each attendant to complete each of their duties. These are the duties that are established on the cleaning frequency schedule. Once the timing and complexity of the duties has been defined, productivity standards can be set accordingly and then monitored and managed by the housekeeping manager. If the performance standards are set too high, the quantity of work that can be accomplished will be too low. The negative impact of this would require the housekeeping manager to add more staff to accomplish all the necessary duties at the high productivity standards. This will increase labor standards and inevitably force the housekeeping manager to release staff and duties. Cleaning rooms efficiently goes by the wayside. However, it would hopefully cause a reevaluation of the productivity standards by housekeeping and the general manager and allow for more realistic productivity standards to be set. If performance standards are set too low, the quantity of work will be too high. This will likely result in an increase of guest complaints and the hotel's quality and appearance to decline rapidly. The housekeeping and general manager may be pleased with their labor expense savings, but the cost is ultimately detrimental because it's impacting the guest stay negatively. The housekeeping and general manager will need to establish higher performance standards and use department expenses wisely. The best way to balance performance standards and productivity standards is to balance them. Because labor is the largest expense, labor costs must be kept top of mind, and the housekeeping manager must always be sure they're monitoring and evaluating the performance of their team and working smarter and more efficiently with the resources that they have available to them. So, for those of you who have a future career goal of being a manager, whether it's a restaurant or a hotel, one thing that you will need to understand is benchmarking. And so it's not in your book, but it is important to understand. It is used in the housekeeping departments, and it's a term you'll probably hear throughout your schooling. So, benchmarking is a standard based on performance. Benchmarking sets appropriate and objectively measurable performance goals. They can be based on internal or external performance standards. Internal performance standards are most common. Most hotels within the United States are managed by multi-unit management companies, so a management company that is contracted by a hotel owner to run the hotel. Data from those hotels can be used in the setting of benchmarks and the analysis of performance. External performance standards are provided by different sources such as the STAR reporting or CoStar, or the American Hotel and Lodging Association. Hotels can use this available data to compare their performance against other like hotels. Benchmark comparisons should always be done with like hotels. The hotels do not need to be the same size. This is because using units of production as a benchmark eliminates the differences between hotels of different sizes. If the benchmark set for cleaning a single guest room is 30 minutes of labor, it doesn't matter if the hotel is 50 or 200 rooms, the benchmark measurement is the same. Benchmarking should always be based on the units of production. For housekeeping, this would be the number of rooms the hotel has in inventory. If we used revenue as a benchmark, the data would be unreliable because each hotel prices themselves differently. Labor benchmarks are based on productivity and not labor cost. This is the same reason why we wouldn't benchmark on revenue. Labor costs and hourly wages or salaries will be different for each hotel. The best measurement is man-hours per unit sold. Man-hours are the unit of measurement that is used to measure the time needed to complete a task. 1 man-hour equals the appropriate output of productivity. Man-hours per unit sold does not have a cost or price attached. This means it can be easily measured between units that have different volumes of business. The man-hours per unit remains the same regardless of the volume or the number of units sold. Cost benchmarks should only be for the expense items where the supply or product has been negotiated for the entire portfolio of hotels. For example, hotels under a specific management company, regardless of their brand affiliation, will have their required supplies negotiated with a specific vendor at a contracted rate. The hotels within that management company will be required to purchase their supplies from that contracted vendor only. The benchmark measurement for the cost of those supplies is what will be used as the measurement for every hotel in that portfolio. This provides a fair and accurate comparison and helps the hotels that fall below the benchmark to identify their shortcomings and put action plans into place. It will also identify hotels that are performing at or above the benchmark. Those performing above can provide best practices to the underperforming hotels. Benchmarks are often used as an incentive for hotel management. This would be in the form of a bonus. Managers that meet or exceed benchmarks are more motivated to achieve positive results when there is a monetary incentive tied to the goal. Not every performance measurement requires a benchmark for performance evaluation and analysis. The number of benchmarks should be limited, and the only ones that are most important should be focused on. For example, labor costs in terms of man-hours per unit sold. We know labor is the highest expense a hotel has, so this would need to be at least one of the chosen benchmarks. Typically, any performance that correlates to revenue earned or expenses saved would need to have a benchmark that can be measured against other like units. How do we develop a benchmark? In most cases, the management company that you work for will tell you the acceptable benchmark level and what performance standard they'll be measuring. To calculate the benchmark, we use the average of the highest performing group of hotels. Typically, we take the average of the top 10% or top 25% of the group. Whatever that figure is the figure your hotel will need to achieve. If a select number of hotels within the portfolio are meeting these standards, then there is no reason why your hotel cannot. And if your hotel doesn't meet the benchmark, you and the general manager will be responsible for figuring out why and presenting an action plan to upper management that details how you will plan to achieve the benchmark on the next evaluation cycle. Remember, a management company is hired by a hotel owner. They are responsible for reporting revenue and profit. If the hotel isn't profitable and it doesn't meet the financial goals of the owner may decide to fire the management company, meaning you are at risk of losing your job. Benchmark measurements are extremely important in this respect. When scheduling staff, the housekeeping manager must know which positions are fixed and which positions are variable. Once this has been determined, then the staffing guide can be created. Fixed positions are those that must be scheduled regardless of the hotel's occupancy levels. These are typically salaried, full-time positions and management positions, such as the general manager, the front office manager, the F&B manager, or the housekeeping manager. Variable positions are scheduled based on the hotel's occupancy. These are typically hourly positions. They're non-management, but may also be supervisory. They include supervisors, room attendants, house persons, laundry attendants, front desk staff, servers, etc. As we've learned so far, we measure productivity, not the cost of labor. Wage rates and salaries are determined by the market in which your hotel is located. Benefits are determined by the state and company policies. This is why we must control the management of labor hours, and that starts with a proper schedule. There are several steps that must be completed first before the schedule can be created and given to employees. First, you'll need to develop a staffing guide. Second, you need to use and understand a forecast. And third, you can set the schedule. A staffing guide is necessary in order to set an appropriate schedule. The schedule is always based on the forecasted occupancy of the hotel. As such, the staffing guide is also developed based on a hotel's forecast for a level of specific occupancy. The staffing guide details how many employees are needed for each position and will help the manager determine the total number of labor hours and estimated labor expense to expect based on the schedule created. It's essential to consider the level of services the hotel offers when creating a staffing guide. For example, a full-service hotel that offers certain amenities will require more staff in different positions than an economy hotel that doesn't offer any amenities or services. There are 3 steps to creating a staffing guide. Step 1, calculate the total labor hours for each scheduled position. So for our purposes, we're only working on the housekeeping position. For our hotel, the productivity standard is 30 minutes to clean 1 room. Every hotel will be different. Our hotel has 250 rooms on property. For our particular day, our hotel is at 90% occupancy. We need to know how many rooms need to be cleaned the next day for our schedule. How many labor hours will it take to clean that number of rooms? Step 2, determine the number of employees that need to be scheduled to work based on the hotel's occupancy and based on our productivity standard. No employee should be scheduled for more than 8 hours a day. The number of employees needing to be scheduled will vary on how many full-time and how many part-time employees there are. The ratio of full-time to part-time employees scheduled that day doesn't matter. Most importantly, the manager needs to make sure they schedule enough employees to meet the number of labor hours needed to clean the rooms without paying overtime. So we don't want to exceed 40 hours per week for each employee, and we want them to only work 8 or less hours per day. For our third and final step, we need to calculate the estimated labor expense based on the hotel's occupancy. Multiply the total labor hours times the average hourly rate. The average hourly rate includes full and part-time employees. The total labor expense should not exceed this amount. So when you actualize your labor expense at the end of the day, the end of the month, and you're looking at it compared to what you budgeted and compared to what you scheduled, it should not exceed what you had scheduled. Pay close attention to this slide and the next slide because you will need these for your assignments this week. This is going to help you with the calculations that you'll be doing when you create your staffing guide and then when you make your staff schedule. This is also in your book. If you don't have a book, that's okay. I'll make sure that you have the pages available to you in Blackboard, but using the slides should explain it to you. It's pretty straightforward as long as you read the information and understand it. So the first thing we want to do is calculate the total labor hours that will be needed when our hotel is at 90% occupancy. So again, this is a fake hotel. This is just an example given. So for our hotel, we need to know how many rooms does the hotel have, how many total rooms in inventory. So we have 250. The day that we're scheduling for, the hotel's occupancy is forecasted to be 90%. And our productivity standard in terms of time is 0.5, which is 30 minutes. So that means that the housekeeper is expected to clean one room in 30 minutes or two rooms in 1 hour. Think of it that way too. The productivity standard can be different for the hotel you work at. Some hotels will have one productivity standard measurement for all room types, including suites. Some hotels will have one productivity standard for regular rooms, standard rooms, and then they might have a slightly higher productivity standard, or they're giving you more time to clean rooms that are suites or larger, or maybe it's a room with a kitchen. So it's just going to depend on your hotel, but you'll have that information from your general manager, and so you'll be able to use it when you create your staffing guide and when you set your schedule. The first step is to determine the number of rooms that need to be cleaned. To do this, multiply the hotel occupancy by the number of rooms in the inventory. So there's 250 rooms total in the hotel. 90% of them are occupied. So 250 times 90% means that there are 225 rooms that need to be cleaned. Your next step is to multiply the number of rooms that need to be cleaned by the productivity standard, so by our half hour. So 225 times 0.5 is 112.5 labor hours. Now, remember your rounding rules from third or fourth or fifth grade. You want to round up. If it's 0.5 or higher, you round up. So in this case, 113 hours. This means that in order to clean 225 rooms, which is 90% occupancy, based on the set productivity standard, you'll need to schedule 113 hours of labor when the hotel is at 90% occupancy. You should not schedule over 113 hours or under 113 hours. Next, we are going to calculate the number of employees we need to schedule based on the number of labor hours that we need. So how many rooms can be cleaned in 8 hours if the productivity standard is 0.5 or 30 minutes per room? You will take 8 hours, because that's the max that one of our shifts will have is 8 hours, and divide that by 0.5. You get 16 rooms per 8-hour shift. So in 8 hours, if a housekeeper is scheduled for 8 hours, they should be able to clean 16 rooms. If they're scheduled for half a shift for 4 hours, they should be able to clean 8 rooms within those 4 hours. How many rooms need to be cleaned? Well, we already calculated this in our first step, right? So we know 225 rooms need to be cleaned. Now you can figure out how many housekeepers need to be scheduled when 225 rooms need to be cleaned. So 225 rooms to be cleaned divided by 16 rooms per 8-hour shift means you need 14.06 housekeepers, or 14. We're rounding down because it's 0.06. So anything under 0.5 goes down. Remember that. At 90% occupancy, the housekeeping manager will need to schedule 14 housekeepers in order to clean 225 rooms. They should not schedule more, and they should not schedule less than this. Knowing the estimated labor expense based on a hotel's forecasted occupancy will help the housekeeping manager set their budget. Each year, each department is responsible for creating a budget and submitting it to the general manager for review. The general manager will have the final approval of the budget, but once that budget is set, the housekeeping manager will need to adhere to it, especially in the area of labor expenses. They'll be responsible for any overages, and they'll need to explain it. This is another reason why a hotel's forecast is important and should be as accurate as possible for the scheduled work week. So our third and final step is to calculate the estimated labor expense. So you will know the average hourly rate, and that will include your full-time and part-time housekeepers. And remember, we're just doing this for a housekeeper position, not the house person or a laundry attendant. We're just focusing on our one position. So your hourly rate for this example is $10. The total number of hours scheduled, you already calculated, so you know from your previous calculation that's 113 hours. So $10 times 113 hours is $1,130 as your total expected labor expense. Now, obviously, this isn't going to include any taxes that are paid out or benefits that are paid out either. So the actual labor expense should not exceed this amount. The schedule should cover an entire work week or a pay period. Because hotel occupancy fluctuates and demand is not predictable, a best practice is to provide the schedule for a 7-day period. The general manager will put out a 10-day forecast, which will be used to create the schedule. However, forecasts change, so it's best to use the most up-to-date forecast when making the schedule. Schedule should be posted at least 3 days before the beginning of the next work week. If the work week begins on a Monday, then the schedule should be posted by Friday before the Monday. I would suggest posting the schedule on a weekday rather than the weekend. While a hotel is a 24-hour business, not everyone works on the weekends. It's best to make sure the schedule is available to everyone so they know when they're working and they don't mistakenly miss a shift. As a manager, you'll figure out the best way to handle requests for time off. When I was a housekeeping manager, I utilized a paper calendar and kept it in the housekeeping office. It was accessible to everyone. If an employee wanted to request a day off, they would write their name on the date on the calendar. I operated on a first come, first served basis, and requests were approved based on hotel occupancy and in the order that they were requested. It didn't matter how long someone had been with the hotel. Approval was given to those who made the request first. I also required at least 2 weeks' notice for any vacation and personal time in. My current boss at Wyndham uses the same process. We have a virtual calendar, and the first person to mark their day gets that day off. We aren't allowed to exceed more than 2 people off on a single day. Just because a schedule is posted doesn't mean it's set in stone. The housekeeping manager is responsible for viewing the hotel's expected occupancy in real time each day of the week for that schedule period. If occupancy has increased from the last forecast that was used to create the schedule, that means more housekeepers are going to be needed. If that happens, then the housekeeping manager will need to find coverage for additional shifts. They'll still need to keep overtime in mind and try to avoid it. As a best practice, the housekeeping manager should start by asking part-time housekeepers that aren't scheduled to work. If there is a risk of overtime, the housekeeping manager or the supervisor will need to step in and clean rooms. The same can be said for decreased occupancy. The housekeeping manager may have to cut staff. This isn't always a pleasant message to deliver, and it is equally as hard to determine who should be cut. The housekeeping manager should start with the employees who are more likely to meet overtime. Another option is to use the extra housekeepers that are scheduled to work on assigned deep cleaning projects. As a manager, you will have employees who call out of work for various reasons or just decide not to show up. It's ideal to keep documentation of these occurrences. One way to do this is to make a note on the schedule and keep a copy. This will come in handy when it's time for employee evaluations. For this week's assignment, you are going to create a staffing guide. This is part 1 of your assignment, and remember that our staffing guide and our schedule is always based on hotel occupancy. So the staffing guide will tell you for a housekeeper how many housekeepers you need to schedule based upon the hotel's occupancy. So this is a screenshot of your assignment. You are going to calculate the number of rooms occupied based on the occupancy percentage, the number of labor hours needed at the occupancy percentage, the number of employees to schedule, and the estimated labor expense. So, as you can see right here in red, I've done an example for you. I did 5% occupancy. So you can see that I've given you all of the occupancies here. 0 should be super easy to do, so no one should get that wrong. So first, you'll need to calculate how many rooms are occupied. So we have 540 rooms at our hotel, at our fictitious hotel. At 5% occupancy, 27 rooms are occupied. So to get that number, I just took our total rooms in inventory, so 540 times our 5% occupancy, and that's how many rooms we have with people in them. So now that you know that, you'll calculate that for each level of occupancy, and you'll fill in the yellow squares. Anything highlighted in yellow, you need to complete, and that's part of your grade. Once you've done that, you need to calculate the labor hours. So I have given you the productivity standard, which is 0.5 or 30 minutes, which means that a housekeeper should clean one room in 30 minutes or 2 rooms per hour. And remember that will be given to you or set by you at the hotel level. So you'll know what that is. And the productivity standard could be less, it could be more. Some hotels will give one productivity standard measurement for every single hotel at the property, regardless of its square footage or room type. It could be standard rooms and suites. Doesn't matter, 30 minutes is all you get to clean it. Some hotels may give you more time to clean a suite. Some hotels may not. And some hotels may give you less time to clean a stayover, and some hotels may just give you one productivity standard across the board. So you'll know what it is when you're in housekeeping, you'll know what the expectation is. So for our labor hours, we are going to take 27, because that's how many rooms are occupied, and we're going to multiply it by our 0.5 productivity standard, or 30 minutes. And that means that we need to be able to clean 27 rooms in 13 and a half hours. So now I need to know how many employees I need to schedule. So if you remember back to our first example, we know that a housekeeper can clean 16 rooms in an 8-hour shift. So knowing that, we take our 27 rooms and we divide it by 16, and that tells us that we need 1.6875 housekeepers to clean 13.5 hours worth of rooms, or 27 rooms, or 5% of our rooms. So we're going to round up. Remember your rounding rules from when you were in elementary school. If it's 0.5 or more, you round up, and if it's less than 0.5, you round down. So this is 1.6, so we round up. So we will need to schedule 2 employees. And last, we are going to determine our estimated labor expense. So we take our average labor expense, which I've given you, which is $16.50, and we are going to multiply that by the number of hours that we need, so 13 and a half. And that gives us $222.75. So that's our estimated labor expense. We do not want to exceed that. And that will be used for budgetary purposes, and it'll be something that you'll have to refer back to. So you'll have to make sure that it gets calculated when you're working in the real world. If you have any questions on part 1 of this assignment, shoot me an email, ask a question in the questions forum. You'll need to do this part first, and then you can move on to the next part, which is the schedule. The second part of your assignment is to create a housekeeper schedule. It will be a 7-day schedule, and remember, it's always based on occupancy. So before you start this part of the assignment, you will need to complete your staffing guide. Now, the first section of the schedule is going to have the number of rooms to be cleaned, the number of labor hours based on occupancy, and the number of housekeepers needed. You've already calculated all of this information, so you'll just need to pull it from your staffing guide. So you're going to go to your staffing guide, go to 100% occupancy, and then see what those figures are, and then plug them in. And you'll do that for each occupancy level that I've given you. Once you've done that, you will create your staff schedule. So for the purposes of our project, of our assignment, we are not going to schedule any employee for more than 36 hours of work per week. And that's because we don't want to risk them getting overtime. So 36 hours gives us a 4-hour buffer. That way, if somebody needs to stay late one day or come in early one day, they're not going to get into overtime because they have a little bit of buffer. 36 hours is still full-time. 32 or more hours is considered full-time employment. So let's keep it to 36. And for a minimum, let's make sure each person has a minimum of 4 hours when they are scheduled. So if they're not off for the day, they're working a minimum of 4 hours. Let's not do like 1 hour or 2 hour, because that wouldn't make too much sense in the real world. Now, when you're making your schedule, you want to make sure that the number of labor hours you're scheduling match the number of labor hours you need based upon the occupancy. So you don't want to schedule over that or under that. So you might have to think a little differently. You might have to use some strategy. Not everyone has to work 8 hours. Someone could work 6.5, 7.5, 4.5, 5.5. I mean, you can use the number that you want as long as you are meeting the number of labor hours based on occupancy. Nobody exceeds 36 hours, and they're working a minimum of 4 hours on the days that they aren't off. Now, it's okay if somebody has 2 or 3 days off per week, not a big deal, but let's keep it to 2 or 3 days. Let's not give someone 4 days off or 5 days off. Let's keep them at 2 or 3. That should be easy to do with this. There shouldn't be any problems with making sure everyone gets at least 2 days off. I mean, that's pretty standard, right? So we want to make sure that we are giving people their time off, their rest time. And remember, the total number of hours scheduled for each employee should equal the total number of hours scheduled. So if you look over here, we've got the total number of hours scheduled for each employee. So this will calculate for you all the way down to so this will sum up for you. There's a formula in there. So this number will equal this number here. So to check yourself, once this number has been calculated, just do some quick math for down here. And as long as this matches this, then you're good. You probably did it right. So you're on the right track if that matches. If you have any questions, let me know. You can shoot me an email. And remember, this part needs to be done second, and the staffing guide will be done first. As always, I hope that you all have a great week. This is our last week of class before spring break. So next week is our spring break. I will be available. If you need anything, please feel free to send me an email. I will monitor my email. If you are missing assignments and you're making them up, spring break is a great time to do that. And if you have questions on the assignments that you haven't completed, let me know. Send me an email. Let's talk about it. My goal for you is to do well in this class. So please know that you can communicate with me. I am open. And if you have any questions, no question is too silly, please ask. Now, for this week's assignment, you need to start early because you might have questions. It might be hard to understand. And I don't want you to wait until Sunday to think that you could complete this entire assignment and then get stuck and not sure what to do. So I will give you 2 attempts to complete this assignment. Your first attempt has to be submitted by the due date. So by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And if you put your first attempt in by then and it's wrong, and I will let you know, I'll grade it, you will have another chance to complete it within 7 days. So keep that in mind. Your second attempt, once you do your second attempt, that's your final grade. I'm not going to give you a third attempt, but keep that in mind. So make sure you start early. Don't procrastinate on the assignment. It's not hard, but it involves math. So I want to make sure that you understand it and that you can get it done and that we have a chance to look at it. And then if you need to do it again, you do it again. If I tell you to do it again and you don't want to do it again and you just want to keep the grade that you got, that's totally fine. That's your responsibility, that's your prerogative, but just know that we can do second attempts on this one as long as your first attempt is in by the due date. So that's key. Other than that, have fun with the assignment. If you have questions in Excel, please let me know. And if you know how to use Excel and you want to pop formulas in to complete the assignment, that's amazing. That's what I did when I worked in housekeeping. All of my staffing guides and my schedules had formulas, and I just had to put in the occupancy, and then it would tell me how many people I needed to schedule. If you want to calculate it by hand, that is great too. As long as you get the right answer, it doesn't matter how you get it. And again, please let me know if you have questions. I'm here, and I again hope you all have a wonderful week, and we'll see you after spring break.